Okay, so David, you're best known as a physicist and an author, and that's certainly how I first came across you. But it was back in 2016 I first noticed you had this unexpected connection to Brexit. I remember in the middle of one of those pre-referendum BBC debates, Michael Gove making use of your name.
No one was more surprised than I.
Right. Well, but he was citing you as a prominent British scientist that agreed with his position. And I've since learned that Dominic Cummings, leader of the Vote Leave campaign and now advisor to Boris Johnson, has credited you in The Spectator, I think, with making the best argument for Brexit, namely this argument from error correction, which we'll talk about.
Yeah, by the way, that's very nice of him, but he also said that had absolutely no effect on the campaign.
Okay, well, fair enough. Maybe it'll have some effect now if we can get the word out, as it were.
Yeah.
But before we get to the argument itself, how did you get wrapped up in all of this?
Well, for many years, I didn't think the issue was at all important. In fact, I voted for staying in the common market during the first referendum, although that was because I believed what we were promised, that there was no intention to make this into a European superstate, and it was a purely economic arrangement.
Right.
And that the chronic problems that existed even at that time, like with the common agricultural policy, we were told that those were being reformed. And I was also reassured because people started talking about a two-track Europe, where one track would be Britain and some other countries that would not have ever closer union, and then the others would have ever closer union, and there'd be two groups of countries in friendly economic relation with each other. And even in this referendum, I could easily have voted Remain if Mr. Cameron's proposals had been taken seriously and if they hadn't sent him home in humiliation.
What were the long-term problems in your mind of the EU that were accruing over time?
So there was the common agricultural policy, and also for Britain, the fisheries policy was... It's only a small thing economically, but it's significant of the kind of problems that arise and normally within the British system would get solved. And then there were issues like freedom of movement. I'm actually in favour of greater immigration, but the freedom of movement in the sense that it was up to the Europeans whom the British government could deport.
Right.
And you might say this was only a handful of people in the end, but again, it was a niggling problem that was thought important by a lot of people and which the British political system had no purchase on. So an even smaller one, I suppose, is we couldn't remove the tampon tax and we found it difficult to forbid the export of live animals. And people will say, well, we could have done that. There would have been a way of doing that. But this is another example of the fact that in Britain, there's a clear path. If you have a grievance, you can join a pressure group. The pressure group will pressure the government, or you can see your MP and the MP will see the grievance building up and so on. Whereas Europe is structured in such a way that it's very difficult to know whom to address your grievance to or what they could do about it.
Well, this brings us to this concept of error correction, which sounds like a harmless bit of jargon, but for you it's a very deep, fundamental principle. Can you lay that out for us and where are you getting that from?
So this is the political theory of Karl Popper, whom I follow in this and other matters. In his political philosophy, he had a definition of democracy, which famously does not include anything about elections. Elections are simply a way, the best known way, of achieving what Popper said was the essence of democracy, the criterion for democracy, which is that governments and policies can be removed without violence. So the more a system is conducive to removing rulers and policies without violence and early in the game, the more it is democratic, according to Popper. And that is the most important criterion in politics, more important than choosing the right rulers in the first place. And that's because of fallibilism. Any system that purports to know in advance what the consequences of a ruler or a policy are going to be is based on a fundamental error of infallibilism. And systems which try to do that clamp down on progress because they entrench the ruler or the policy.
So it's your view that UK institutions, traditions, culture does a better job of error correction and has done historically than the EU? What
Yes.
is it about the UK and the EU that makes them so different?
Well, there are many aspects to this. One thing that obviously goes in that direction is the first past the post electoral system. Although I must say that formal systems are really not what it's all about. It's really about how individuals think of their relationship with the government, with the state, and with other individuals. That goes very deep. And it is because of that certain institutions have certain properties. Now, a property of first past the post that I particularly favour and that Popper favoured is that the government is maximally vulnerable to changes in opinion in the electorate. It only takes a few percentage points change in the electorate to make a large change in Parliament and possibly remove the government and replace it by another government. So in the British system, with first past the post, the Prime Minister wakes up every morning afraid that something might happen that day that will shake his hold on power. And that if people change their minds, he will lose at the next election, or the election could come early if it hadn't been for these constitutional changes that messed some of this stuff up. That he could be removed, and if he was, the opposition would get into power, and they would be in charge.
Right.
Now, any other system dilutes this feature, because if a government under, for example, a proportional representation system loses a few percentage points of support, the first thing they will try to do is form a new coalition, because they will already be in a coalition. This will change the electoral logic of the coalition, so they will form a different coalition. So it can easily happen that a swing in the population, in the electorate, in one direction, let's say to the right, causes the government to move to the left, because the left-wing government will ally with an even more left-wing party, which they had previously been able to rule without. And this isn't just a theoretical thing. It happens all the time in non-first-past-the-post electoral systems. In fact, we've seen in the last few elections that that even the first-past-the-post system is not immune to this. It can happen, but we've had coalitions, but it's much rarer in first-past-the-post systems. And when it does happen, the logic of the system is to go back to evenly balanced.
I mean, it seems to me what you're talking about is preserving both leadership and accountability. If it's the case that a third party like the Lib Dems or UKIP gain in popularity, gain in seats through advocating a particular policy like Brexit, then one would hope that one of the major parties would then think, well, if I want to stay as the leader, then I need to suck up that policy in order to prevent the opposition getting in.
Yes, yes. And what they will generally do, if they're in power, if they're the party in power, they will do it in such a way as to make it more palatable to them and to their voters, to their constituents as well. And if they're in opposition, they will do the same. And then who wins depends on who has the best arguments about how to accommodate this new problem. And if they're wrong, they will get to implement their wrong policy. That is crucial. And that's why power and responsibility go together. If you have a system that allows those in power to do what they think is right, then it will be clear whose fault it is when it goes wrong. And it'll also be clear that it was the opposition's fault for opposing it if it goes right.
Right. And hence you can learn and you can make progress and you can improve how society works.
This is how political knowledge is created.
As opposed to just sort of persisting in a perpetual state of argument about what would be right if only we had our way, but never really knowing what works.
That's exactly it. Okay. And no one ever gets proved wrong.
You've built that idea up in a kind of UK context. I'm imagining the Conservatives, Labour, Lib Dems, UKIP. But what is it about the EU that fails these tests of fallibilism and error correction?
It seems to have been designed to make it difficult to know who is responsible for a policy. So policy gets decided by consensus, avoiding confrontation, trying to accommodate different strands of opinion within the policy, and therefore no great changes of policy ever happen, only tweaks to the policy. And this is the case even when there are huge problems perceived by the electorate. For example, immigration, waves of immigrants, and it's not that the wrong policy was implemented and then it would now be corrected and replaced by a better policy. It's that no policy was implemented. And the EU is just unable to formulate one because there is no party in power in the EU. There is no prime minister or president who is in charge, who is the leader of something that has an ideology that could be proved wrong.
I remember being quite struck by something that you said to me in private a few months ago about how the UK Parliament sits opposite each other. I actually was sat in the balcony a few months ago watching it like a great theatre set with the speaker in the middle. Whereas the EU sits in a circle. And this sort of symbolises the difference between a kind of disputational culture where you can point at the person who's responsible and shout at them and, force them to take responsibility for what they're doing. And this system where it's all about sort of consensus, but an artificial consensus and a kind of soft consensus that nobody can really change or update.
To make the policy in a closed room where the voters who voted for one way or another are just represented by the number of delegates that they make, and those can form into a coalition that maybe wasn't even envisaged before the election. And that coalition forms policies that weren't envisaged before the election, were never voted on, can't be voted on again, because if you vote one way or another, a different coalition will form that you can't predict. This fact that the legislature sits in a circle and the British one sits facing each other at 2 swords' lengths, apparently, is indeed emblematic. Although I have to keep saying that the real nature of institutions is in culture. They are in human minds. They are ideas. How they are implemented in terms of buildings and laws and constitutions and so on is a secondary thing. But it is, in this case, emblematic. And another instance of the same thing is the British legal system, which is also adversarial and is in contrast to I think, all or maybe just most European countries where it's not, where the idea is that everybody is there to find the truth. And you can't find the truth that way. You've got to have advocacy of something and confronting the opposing arguments with each other.
Yes. I'm very enamoured of, do you know Jonathan Haidt?
No.
He's sort of a social scientist who says that reasoning is not a solo process. You almost can't do it. The fact of confirmation bias means that everybody, no matter how rational they believe they are, really wants their theory to be true and will fight for it. And a person on their own can't do science. They have to be immersed in a culture of criticism where, they're terrified of peer review and the review will rip their paper to shreds if they make a mistake, and truth is approached in the social way as opposed to a purely rational way.
Popper also said that science is a social process, and there too the emphasis is on facilitating the removal of bad ideas or the modification of bad ideas in the light of experiment and also in the light of criticism.
Do you think it's these mechanisms of error correction that explain the relative political stability of Britain through the centuries compared to Europe, which tends to kind of go for these massive projects, communism, fascism, the EU, systems that seek total control, but then are vulnerable to a tipping point when suddenly 51% of the forces are against them and collapse occurs?
Well, it's certainly true that Britain is famous for political stability over decades and centuries. And if you don't think it's due to that, I think if you don't think it's due to the political culture of Britain, you have a hard time explaining this blatant difference between Britain and the rest of Europe. and also other countries. Now, I think it is not an accident that, say, in the 20th century, which was the high tide of both totalitarianism, that is fascism and Nazism and communism, and also nationalism, and where this sort of engulfed Europe, and even in the places where it didn't get into power, it affected the political system and influenced everything. And yet in Britain, it never even got close to power. And this was the same over a longer timescale as well. Political philosophers in Europe simply held it as uncontroversial that the British political system was very stable and that this was something they wanted to emulate. The only explanation that makes sense to me is exactly what you said, that the institutions that correct errors and therefore build consent before grievances rise to the level of people wanting to use violence, thereby create stability. And it's stability despite rapid change. That's the difficult thing. You can have stability for decades and sometimes even centuries if you keep things the same. But stability under rapid change is very difficult to achieve, and it requires these institutions of criticism.
Well, I guess you might say that the situation we're facing in the UK at the moment, in terms of this complete political deadlock, is as a result of the referendum suddenly springing Brexit upon us, as opposed to it emerging naturally by the political first past the post process.
Absolutely. I think the referendum is very alien to the British way of doing politics. It arose as a sort of desperate measure because other problems were building up and were not being solved. And the politicians were getting used to dissipating responsibility. They were used to saying, oh, it's EU rules, or we can't do this, or we're going to negotiate this, or whatever, rather than saying, we think this is right, and it's going to have good effects, and you'll see. And we got in, therefore we're in charge now, and we will implement that. And we're now sticking our necks out, because if it's deemed to be not true, we know the other party is going to come in. That is what should have happened. Now, with the EU, I think what I would have expected to happen would be that the grievance or the grievances of the leavers and the ones who felt passionately about it would be putting pressure on the existing parties to accommodate that in their policies. And eventually it might have led to a party adopting leave as its party policy.
Yeah, or forcing through the kind of tier 1, tier 2, we want to stay on tier 1.
Exactly.
That kind of attitude.
At the same time, parties' policies on relations with the EU would have had that pressure on that. And it was happening. It was, the UKIP was rising, and the tensions within both the major parties were rising. And normally this would have led to creative thinking about other policies. And since that didn't happen, or at least didn't happen fast enough, Mr. Cameron decided to risk a referendum, which, if it had gone his way, would have enabled him to say, it wasn't me, it was the people. And the people can't be removed from office. So
the people
with a capital T and P, and they have spoken, and therefore we're going to do what they say. And he had to say that, well, if they say the other thing, then we'll do what they say, and that clashed with all the other institutions of government, because it meant that suddenly Parliament was being told to implement something they don't believe in. The whole structure of the British parliamentary system is that people implement what they believe in. And only then is their responsibility.
How deep and how far back do you think this distinction between the sort of UK way of life and European way of life goes? English individualism, European collectivism, all that?
Although I think it is true that one notable difference in culture between Britain and the rest of Europe is the British greater emphasis on individualism. I think that is not really the heart of the matter, because Britain has had periods of collectivism too. After World War II, the Labour government came in and instituted a regime that is more left-wing than any regime instituted elsewhere in Western Europe. And yet, unlike everywhere else where highly left-wing regimes were instituted, Britain embarked on it, seriously tried it out, and then eventually rejected most of it, but kept some of it. We still have the NHS, we're still proud of that. We still have all sorts of reforms regarding education, some of which were disasters, some of which were good, and all of them were implemented by people who believed in them and who were therefore either proved right or wrong by events.
This is funny that I've come to ask you about Brexit, but now you're giving succour to the socialists. You know, perhaps Britain is the one place where socialism has worked and could work again.
I think socialism qua economic theory has never worked anywhere, but Britain is certainly one of the few places where a full-blown socialism was tried and did not cause permanent damage. It did not degenerate into communism and totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and so on, which is what it normally has a tendency to do. But it showed no such tendency in Britain.
So what is the distinction between the UK model and the European model in your own mind, if not individualism versus collectivism?
Yes, I think it is institutions of criticism, of error correction, and therefore of consent. So that they become institutions of consent when they're working.
That word you just used, consent, is the big one as far as I'm concerned. I do not like forcing other people to do anything they don't want to do. And if I want them to do something that they don't want to do, I make it my business to persuade them or give up. You know, I never want to go beyond that.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. There's a very nice quote by Popper at some point where he says something like, a rationalist is a person who would rather not get his way because he's failed to persuade other people than to get his way by force, by forcing other people.
Right.
And I entirely agree with that. And there are many issues where I think the country is going the wrong way. But, you know, if I were magically given the power to get my way, I certainly would not use it. That would destroy everything. Okay,
well, so in this spirit of Popperian criticism, conjecture, refutation, yes. I feel I should put to you some of the best kind of Remain arguments if I can.
Yes.
I put out a call on my Facebook page a few days ago to just kind of ask people what in their minds is the most important reason to stay in the EU. And the first and foremost was the prevention of war. I mean, isn't it the case that economic integration has fostered this unprecedented period of peace and stability in Europe? And as important as error correction might be, isn't the prevention of war more important than that?
I think it isn't factually true that it is the EU or the common market, as it was, that has prevented war. There was a theory even before World War I that the economics of the different countries were becoming so integrated that war would be impossible. And it simply wasn't true. When political forces made countries aggressive, they naturally thought that that was more important than their economic well-being. I mean, if you're going to have a war, you know that it's not going to promote economic well-being, at least in the short run.
You don't think that if Hitler had been tied into the European Union, he wouldn't have been Hitler, or Hitler wouldn't have emerged?
Yes, if you put it like that, it's obviously absurd.
Is it obviously absurd? I mean, Germany was in a position of sort of humiliation after World War I and had felt belittled by the rest of the European powers, and that's what made Nazism attractive. And if they'd been engaged in a kind of positive, fruitful trading relationship with that emotional impetus for fascism, I've been there.
That was the emotional impetus, and I think that being subordinated to France would not have helped in that respect. That is not the change that happened after World War II. Germany had set itself on a new course in 1945 by being defeated in war. The Nazi ideology had been tested to destruction. It simply wasn't true that if one has a strong enough will, one can conquer, and that racial superiority would give them the good things in life. And they nationally changed their opinion of what it is that gives you the good things in life to the right one. And they made a national policy of pursuing that, and they have been successful. And the reason that Germany is not dangerous now is that change of mind which happened before they joined the EU and was perhaps a reason they joined the common market. Perhaps a reason why they joined it, not vice versa.
All right, well, so I suppose the second most important argument is the economic argument. I think it was Nick Clegg that put this most clearly in my mind, that Europe will always be our closest geographical neighbour. So if we're going to be involved in a kind of monogamous trading relationship with somebody, shouldn't it be Europe? It's much easier to just ship things over the channel than it is across the Atlantic or to India. Do we really have more sovereignty involved in a trading relationship with America than we do with Europe?
I have heard that argument many times in many different forms. I think the thing that misses is that trade is mutually beneficial. So, of course, we should trade with our neighbours. We should trade with everyone. And by the way, long-range trade is easier than it ever was before, and an increasing proportion of our trade is much longer range than with the EU. But that doesn't matter. The distance doesn't matter. We should trade with everyone. And I'm also in favour of reducing tariffs so that tariff harmonization and so on should become less and less a thing. It should become less and less important. Now, it is true that sometimes political considerations override economic welfare considerations, and governments do unwise things. Like at the moment, there's a big thing about increasing tariffs, having trade wars. This is a terrible idea, and it has been tried again and again, and but I don't think that belonging to a monopolistic trade entity is the solution to this. And even if it were, subordinating one's political system to that entity is not advocated by anyone. No one in Canada advocates that they should become the 51st state in order to get a couple of percentage points on their GNP, which if those percentage points are available, they're available through trade, not through subordinating Canada to the federal government in the US.
When I voted Remain in the referendum, one of my thoughts was, I think it would be good if power could be concentrated at many levels appropriate to the problems it solves. I quite like local government in the UK, English, Welsh, Scottish, Northern Irish. But I recognise that at the higher level, there are problems like climate change or international terrorism or the power of international corporations, which are much more powerful than individual states in a way. And I quite like a supranational institution that was capable of standing up to them. How do you react?
I think that objection or that argument for Remain mixes two very different things. One is the issue of international cooperation. And the other is the issue of what political systems should be subordinated to which other ones. Now, we have international cooperation of many different kinds. NATO is an international organization, and it's actually an international organization for the control and direction of violence. And even so, it never purports to override the sovereignty of its members. So international cooperation is a good and necessary thing. And in regard to the environment too, we have long-standing international agreements that work very well on Antarctica and on the law of the sea and on the ozone layer and all sorts of things. And countries which participate in these things do not usually demand political control of other countries.
Well, this point is going to sound absurd as soon as I sort of say it out loud, but I think a lot of people at the back of their minds do think, aren't there advantages to top-down control? I mean, an argument that's often made to me, it came up on my Facebook thread, is that I don't really trust British democracy to deliver the right result. It delivered Thatcherism, and I hate Thatcherism. You know, I have friends who used to work in the post office and know which EU regulation it was that prevented them having to do unlimited overtime, and they see the EU as a sort of beneficent provider of rights that British democracy wouldn't provide of its own accord. I mean, what would you say to someone like that?
Well, I think that even if it were true that the current political stance, which is nobody's idea, let me repeat, it's nobody's idea of what is right, it's just something that emerges from the mists. Even if you thought that happened to be best for Britain now, it is still something that is preventing change, Britain from making changes for the better. We were talking earlier about the benefits of socialism to Britain. Those things could not have been tried if Britain had been a member of the EU at the time. It would have been against EU law.
So all this business of, we have to protect the NHS by staying in the EU.
Well, the EU do not have an NHS.
No.
But certainly the whole point of harmonisation and ever closer union is that individual countries' experimentation is limited. The thing about the British experiment with socialism is that it had good effects and bad effects, and the good effects were retained and the bad effects were abandoned. And the EU has never done anything like that in its entire history. And it's structured in such a way that it shouldn't be able to. Perhaps I should mention that systems that are good at error correction make more errors. Sounds paradoxical, but they make more errors than systems which are bad at error correction until the catastrophe happens. So systems which are bad at error correction fudge and fudge and fudge until at some point everything breaks and they're forced to do something new, usually at random. Usually it's the devils have changed places and the lash goes on sort of thing.
Well, let me take that opportunity to hit you with another counter-argument, which would be, since you don't think referendums are a good idea, wasn't the first one illegitimate? I mean, we didn't know what leave meant. Should we have another one to specify what leave means, see if people want that? Do you think a 4% difference between the sides was really enough to justify this dramatic change of policy now? Should we remain now and then, as you say, have Brexit in the future through this gradual process?
I think that if there's anything worse than having a referendum to decide a national issue, it's having one and not implementing the result. That is what has caused lack of confidence in the legitimacy of the whole system, not just the referendum. And if there were a second referendum, people would know that the arguments for the illegitimacy of the first one would apply double in the case of the second one, because people would then want a third one. So long as the outcome of the referendum isn't implemented, nobody is proved wrong. One can say, okay, now we know what would happen. We don't know what would happen. All we know is what happened after the referendum, not what happened as a result of implementing it. Now, if the Remainers had taken my view about what politics should be about, then as soon as they lost the referendum, they should have transformed themselves into a rejoin movement, not a movement to delegitimize the national vote. And if they're right, then leaving would be a disaster. By the way, we'd have left ages ago. This would all be over by now. Leaving would be a disaster, and they would have swept into power with plans to rejoin. And those plans would have been endorsed by a general election, not by a referendum. One can say we don't know anything, we don't know anything. Everything we say we know at the moment is prophecy. And that is a curse word in the Popperian scheme of things. Prediction comes from explanatory theories, and we can't have an explanatory theory about the growth of knowledge.
I think some people listening to that would say, it's all very well having this scientific mindset that we should have an experiment to decide the outcome, but isn't there so much at stake? Won't there be EU nationals in this country who might face deportation? I mean, probably not on purpose, but through bureaucratic fuck-ups. Won't the economic hit the poorest harder? Is taking a risk worth it?
There is a general answer to that question, which is also why it is more important than any specific policy. It is that making a policy of not experimenting, which means not implementing what anyone thinks is the right thing to do, but implementing something else that no one thinks is the right thing to do, is a recipe for stasis. And stasis in politics is hell on earth. Mistakes will always be made. That's another aspect of Popper's philosophy, that we have to recognize that we're fallible and that there is no way of choosing a ruler or choosing a policy that knows what the outcome of that will be, that can guarantee it will be good, or that it will probably be good, or anything like that. Creativity is needed to do good things, and creativity is in response to problems. Now, it is self-deception to think that the status quo is going to be satisfactory for everyone forever. It's already not satisfactory for a lot of people. We take it for granted that the whole political system is about grievances. Ancient declarations talk about the right of the people to petition for redress of grievances. And that doesn't mean that there are 37 grievances and once they've all been met, we won't have grievances anymore. Quite the contrary. Grievances are always coming up. Disagreements about what is right are always coming up. And the paramount consideration is how to resolve those, not just without violence, but long before violence is even on anyone's mind. As soon as they become serious enough to affect 1 or 2% of the vote in an election, politicians and think tanks and intellectuals and academics and the whole country will be thinking about how to solve it and how to persuade people that one's idea is the right one to solve it. That's obviously more important than getting any one thing right once and for all, because once and for all will never happen.
One last Remain argument I'd like to put to you, which I think is kind of the most profound argument and the one that speaks to people most deeply, is the argument about racism. I know I tried to kind of be rational when I was listening to the referendum debates, and to be honest, I found myself more stupid by the end of it than at the beginning. I learned almost nothing from watching weeks of Question Time episodes. But what really swung it for me was the day that Breaking Point, Nigel Farage poster came out and Joe Cox was shot, and I just thought, there's absolutely no way I'm voting with those guys. You know, I think that feeling is pretty ubiquitous in this country. And how do you speak to that instinct?
Well, interestingly, the Vote Leave campaign thought that poster and the UKIP side of the Leave argument cost them votes and almost cost them the referendum. That is their opinion.
I didn't know that.
I don't think anyone hates UKIP more than Vote Leave does. They thought that this tendency almost cost them the referendum because of the fact that tiny numbers of people are actually
fanatically racist.
Fanatically racist, yes. A larger number of people are inclined to be persuadable by arguments with a tinge of racism because perfectly legitimate considerations sometimes overlap with arguments that have a tinge of racism, and they find themselves allies with people whom they might not agree with.
Yes.
But those groups together do not amount to anything like a majority.
Thank goodness.
And thank goodness. And therefore, no matter how much you fire up those people to vote for you, you're not going to win the referendum. Quite aside from the fact that many of the major players in Vote Leave are, like me, constitutionally and emotionally in favour of more immigration. So, I mean, I myself can't get my head round the idea that I shouldn't be in favour of Leave because it's racist, because that's kind of the opposite way to the way it looks to me.
Yeah.
The argument should not be about who is in favour. You know, if it turns out that Mr. Putin is in favour of one or the other, or Mr. Trump is in favour of one or the other, that doesn't alter who is right.
No,
it's an ad hominem thing, and one should not make that a consideration.
I completely agree with you in my head, but my heart is so disciplined by this sort of fear of being anywhere near to racism that, you know, I feel nervous about filming and broadcasting this conversation with you, you know, because to advocate for Brexit is to be on that side. And I think a lot of people feel that. It runs very deep, which in a way is a wonderful thing. People should feel deeply opposed to racism.
Yes.
But
yes, well, I mean, I too have found that people have put this argument to me, not in the way that you just did, but in the form, well, you make a reasonable argument, but most of the people who are on your side in this are not reasonable. Now, I think that isn't true. Basically, I can't remember anyone whom I've spoken to on the Leave side making a racist argument. Maybe some of them are in their hearts racist, but they know that that won't speak to other leavers. And by the way, it's also a fact that in all the surveys you see, Britain is one of the least bigoted countries in the EU. Which, that's another sort of ironic thing about this argument from racism. So you've just given a list of pro-Remain arguments, and you haven't mentioned the argument, you are a racist, which one often hears as well. And in fact, I think it is very unfair to the British people to characterize large-scale political movements as being motivated by racism in any way. People just don't think like that in this country. Which is related to the fact we were talking about earlier, that nationalism, which was the scourge of Europe from say, the mid-19th century up to the mid-20th century, never got a hold in Britain.
Yeah, it's something to be very proud about.
Yes.
I have to say, speaking to you, I've discovered a kind of hitherto hidden streak of patriotism, just because I always thought patriotism in Britain was about the flag and the army and bulldogs and the Second World War, but you make me realise that the UK is about things that I do care personally about, namely consent, humility, discourse, discussion, tolerance, moderation.
I entirely agree, and note that I am an immigrant, and it is often immigrants who appreciate what is best about Britain. I'm reminded of a quotation which George Mikesh made in his book How to Be an Alien, which is the quintessential book on Britishness by an immigrant, written just after World War II. He was a refugee, and he quotes a poem by Alice Duer Miller, who's an American poet. And the line he quotes is, "I have seen much to hate here, much to forgive, but in a world where England is finished and dead, I do not wish to live."
Oh, that's lovely.
And I think that is precisely true, as well as rather painfully sentimental.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more content at the intersection of science, philosophy and politics, then please consider donating to my Patreon or my PayPal account. You'll find the links in the description.